Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer Fantasy lore. I know, 2 weeks in a row, but after having talked about the Knights Panther, I really want to talk about the Great Crusade to dislodge Araby from the Western world. Or, well, the Southern world, actually, in this particular case, but details. As this is a pretty major conflict that has actually been expanded upon significantly in sort of kind of more recent Warhammer Fantasy history, as back in the day, Araby was something that existed, but we didn't know anything about it beyond Mukhtar's desert dogs, and that was about it. However, back in the heady old days of 2005, Araby actually received an army list. Well, sort of, anyways. An army list for War Master, the specialist game, but still an army list nevertheless. And so, today then, we are going to talk about the Great Crusade against Araby. Beginning with the villain of the piece, the Sultan Jaffar. The precise nature of his rise to power is a debated issue. Some claim that he was a local warlord, a minor king, or a tribal leader, originating from somewhere in the shallow desert between Araby's coastal holdings and the deep desert of Nehekara. From there, he would have then conquered nearby tribes and kings, eventually pulling together those he did not subjugate via force into a military alliance that led him to the coast and conquest of Araby's major cities. Others claim that he was a sorcerer, a wizard of the deep desert that drew upon the powers of mighty jinn, elemental creatures of some claim chaos, others claim powers more ancient still, to subjugate his enemies and assassinate all who stood before him. The truth is probably somewhere a little in between. Jafar does indeed appear to have been a powerful magic user, and in the lands of Araby, that usually means some sort of contract with the jinns of the land. Now, as for what exactly a jinn is, that's a bit of a complicated question, as the jinns are, in all due likelihood, very, very ancient and relatively natural beings. Probably something created during the Old One's reign over the Warhammer world. Because unlike true creatures of magic, e.g., chaos, the jinn can exist in an area that is not suffused with the power of chaos. There have been occasional suggestions that the jinn instead feed off magical power in and of itself, in other words, the winds of magic, or chaos, but this seems extraordinarily unlikely, especially considering their claimed power level. So, in all due probability, the jinn are some sort of more or less natural creature, or a end result of some Old One experiment, now bound to the desert lands of Araby, or to particularly powerful artifacts. Which is probably where the myth of them being magical creatures come from, as they can indeed be subjugated and tied to material items, often urns or lamps. And whilst they are thus bound, they can be forced to carry out certain tasks. For example, there is a particularly vain and powerful magician currently residing in the modern-day lands of Araby that uses no less than 4 separate jinns to power his ship. But natural creatures or not, the jinn do also have a pretty strident reputation for being enormous assholes. seeming to take tremendous pleasure in leading mortals astray or tricking them into bargains that will lead to their doom. And there are those who claim that Jafar were one of these unfortunate individuals, having been promised great wealth, success, and power by the jinns, only to be in the end betrayed by them. Now, in all due likelihood, Jafar did indeed command the allegiance of at least some jinns. Whether or not they, in turn, commanded his, or if they did indeed trick him to his doom, is open to speculation. But a wizard of Jafar's stature and power, and success as well, makes me doubt that he was so easily manipulated. But to return then to the reality of the situation, the truth as to how Jafar became such a successful conqueror, leading a loose coalition of various desert tribes and minor kingdoms to conquer the 4 great cities of the Arabian coastal lands. Cities of such power, prestige, and wealth that they were all but in essence capitals in their own right. The cities of Al-Haik, Kofair, Martek, and Lashiek. These mighty cities, of course, had vast defences of their own, along with sizable standing armies and countless private guards operated by grand citizens, local sultans, and caliphs. Normally, they would be utterly impervious to the aggression of small, scattered desert tribes. But Jafar, of course, was not only a capable military commander and a powerful sorcerer in his own right, but his enemies also had a nasty habit of dying. Either due to sharp and pointed objects being introduced into their spines, or choking on spiced tea laced with a strange, glowing green venom. And somehow, Jafar's armies always knew where their enemies were. They always knew every weak spot in their enemies' defenses, and even managed to infiltrate many a city without ever needing to lay siege to their outer walls. Almost as if he had little furred friends, leaking him information and disposing of his enemies. And indeed he did, as a big part of the secret behind the success of the great and mighty Sultan Jaffar were, as ever, the mighty, the glorious, the noble Skaven. Leading me to state yet again that behind every successful desert warlord stands a giant, fuzzy, brown rat, standing on its hind legs. As it was indeed the creatures of Skaven Blight that were behind the rapid rise of Jafar. They were the ones who made sure that all of those who opposed his rise would run into unfortunately abrupt and painful ends, indicating to all others that Jafar possessed special powers, magical abilities, and if they wanted to stay amongst the living, they'd better not oppose him. Of course, the Skaven did not commit to all of this out of the warm and fuzzy feelings hiding deep within their hearts. Not at all. They did this for the usual reasons: warp tokens, first and foremost. And Jafar had apparently come across quite the cache of this glowing green ore, which he was now handing out in measured quantities to his brand new fuzzy little friends. But after having gained control of the coastal regions of Araby, Jafar was beginning to settle in, becoming probably another major power in the region. And if it had been up entirely to Jafar, he might very well have been satisfied with just this. I mean, it would make him one of the single richest individuals in the entirety of the old world. He would have lived surrounded by big-bosomed women for the rest rest of eternity, eating whatever he wanted, no matter how ridiculously rare, and probably dining on larks' tongues or some other absurd niche thing imported at ridiculous, ruinous expense from the other end of the planet. But his shaggy siblings in success had other plans. See, some 300-odd years earlier, the Skaven had, unjustifiably so of course, been driven out of the lands of the Empire, to which the Skaven clearly had legitimate claim. And to add injury to insult, they had suffered considerable casualties at the hands of the mad, mass-murdering, psychopathic, genocidal crazy person known as Mandred Ratslayer. The very name stinks of rat phobia. And ever since, the Skaven had not really been in a great position to expand upon their original holdings deep within the blighted marshes. Their population had taken quite a serious hit due to their failed defense of the Empire, and whilst they were still expanding throughout the mountains of the world, trying to mess with the dwarves as they were usually easy prey, they would have preferred to expand into the nearby lands of Estalia and Tilea. And now they had a human warlord that owed them quite a lot. Now, of course, humans are, as ever, untrustworthy and treacherous creatures, so instead of asking him outright, the Skaven manufactured certain evidence suggesting that Estalia was preparing to invade Araby en masse, and might even be planning to enlist the aid of the Empire, Bretonnia, and Tilea in so doing. Such a coalition would undoubtedly mean the end of Jafar, and there was, of course, no doubt whatsoever that these nations were deeply jealous of what he had achieved in his desert homeland. Those covetous northerners wanted all of his stuff for their own. And so Jafar, guided by his new best sewer-dwelling friends, organized a massive army and a huge fleet with which to ferry them across the great ocean and to Estalia, where their first target would be the de facto capital city of Magritta. The force that landed on Estalia's southern shores was quite typical of an Arabian army, with serried ranks of masked spearmen making up the bulk of the invading force. These troops were recruited from villages, settlements, and local town militias. They are, in essence, the citizen soldiers of Araby, though they should not be confused for mere militia, as the Arabian spearmen are given extra training and excellent equipment from the very deep coffers of Araby, and as mentioned, they are usually also seasoned military personnel, at the very least insofar as garrison troops are concerned. They would be supported by massed numbers of bowmen as well. The bow is a weapon of some status in Araby, as only those who have enough riches saved up to afford the privilege of leisure time with which to train with a bow are capable of drawing their very powerful compound weapons. The invading army would also have boasted a number of formations of Sultanate guards. These are rather fascinating little formations, as no two are ever the same, not in terms of weapons, armor, armament, names, organization, or size, as they are, as the name implies, the private guards of very high-ranking Arabian individuals. Jafar, of course, would have his private guard, but many minor kings, even potentially tribal lords, sultans, and caliphs, would also have their own private guards, equipped luxuriously so at their own expense, who then fight in a manner pleasing to their lord. These are not mere toy soldiers, however, as Araby tends to be a land of significant upheaval, shall we say, and any caliph or sultan unable or unwilling to readily defend his own palace against anyone who might wish to take what he has accumulated over the years will swiftly be relieved of his financial burdens. This also means that the Guard are very, very loyal, as they are paid handsomely in order to make sure that no other Sultan or Caliph decides that it would be far easier to bribe his rival's guardsmen than invade his private palace. The infantry would further be ably supported by a mix of horsemen as well. The Akinsis were light raiders and scouts, armed with bows, light lancers, and long curved cavalry sabers. They were amongst the elites of the Arabian armies, trusted to be the eyes and ears of the massed host of Araby, and also a key and crucial weapon in desert warfare, both for locating the enemy and harassing them as they advanced across the vast and inhospitable dunes of their home country. Once these troops had managed to locate the enemy, they would bring in the coup de grace in the form of the Sipahis, heavy lance cavalry. Protected by exquisitely crafted scale mail armor and riding upon some of the finest steeds in a nation already famous for their equestrian prowess. They might not be a match for the Knights of Bretonnia or the Empire in terms of sheer weight and shock impact, but when it came to maneuvering in the dunes of the desert, they were infinitely more nimble and could serve alongside their scout-riding companions with far greater ease, acting as a combined force. There may also have been a few more exotic entries into the Arabian host as well, like camelry, riders mounted upon desert-dwelling camels. Obviously, these are not going to have the speed of a horse, nor necessarily the shock and impact awe of fully mounted armored lancers. But in the deep deserts, they are by far the finest of mounts, allowing their riders and the mounts themselves to range out far ahead of the army. And they also possess certain special advantages against the mounted enemies that they might face, as horses are really not particularly fond of camels, not their sounds nor their smells. And if horses don't like camels, they really, really don't like elephants. Now, these massive, incredibly dangerous living siege machines that the Arabian armies field at enormous expense are specialized in their usage, shall we say. Elephants are not nimble creatures. They are not subtle weapons of war. They are quite literally massive, fleshy battering rams, designed to impose a morale shock upon the enemy as much as they are intended to break open their ranks with their vast, fleshy hides. As, in reality, elephants are not actually great beasts of war. They are too big, too slow, too lumbering, too obvious, and actually too intelligent, as elephants don't enjoy squishing things. They find it icky. And furthermore, they understand that if they are currently being stabbed to death by dozens of sharp objects being thrust into their hides, they might be better off turning around and heading the other way, which can lead to some pretty serious complications in a massed battle. But these shortcomings aside, the sheer impact of a dozen elephants is it's difficult to compare to anything else, even in the old world, short of perhaps dragon ogres. It should also be mentioned that the elephants and the camels would not necessarily find Estalia particularly welcoming. Probably not to the point where they would be majorly inconvenienced, but Estalia is definitely very, very different from the deserts of Araby. It is certainly not the lushest of lands in the old world by any stretch of the imagination, covered in many cases by large, vast, open gold plains, but still, it's hardly a desert. Fortunately for Jafar, though, he was not going to have to engage in any major set-piece battles right out of the gate. He had landed his army relatively close to the de facto capital, and had moved swiftly to place it under siege. The armies of Estalia, often relying on mercenaries as much as any standing force, were not at all ready for this invasion, as quite contrary to the noble, honourable, and always truthful Skaven, Estalia hadn't actually been planning any invasion of Araby. And so, when thousands upon thousands of Arabians showed up on their shore, apparently intent on staying, that was a rather uncomfortable surprise, frankly. And whilst the city of Margarita was fortified and could probably stand up to the invaders for a time, it became immediately and painfully apparent to the ruling council, the Arch-Ecclesiatium, or some other nonsensical word, that they would not be able to hold out for long, nor did they stand any real chance of reversing their fortune in this war. If the Arabians had, as every indicator appeared to suggest, come to stay, then the Estalians would not be able to kick them back out again on their own. And so they rapidly came to the conclusion that they would need to dispatch messengers calling for aid. The ruling council of, I'm not going to try to pronounce that again, dispatched riders post-haste to their neighbours. First and foremost, Bretonnia, and to the court of Louis the Righteous. The messengers brought the word that the Arabians had come to stay. This was not some slaver raid, this was an invasion, intent on expanding the evil Sultan Jaffar's influence and power upon the lands of the old world. And if Bretonnia did not act, then undoubtedly Jafar would come for them next. And, well, to be fair, whilst the next target of Jafar's invading forces would probably have been Tilea, as they too would, conveniently, have just so happened to have been planning an invasion of Araby as well, gasp, shock and surprise, said the Skaven messenger. These extensive invasion plans would probably eventually have extended to Bretonnia too, as the Skaven would have desperately desired to aid Araby in securing their rightful place in the snow, I suppose, by just so coink-dinkly-winkly weakening all of the Skaven's neighbours. Fortunately for Estalia, King Louis did not require much in the way of convincing. As, one, he was not particularly comfortable with Araby extending its domain all the way up to Bretonnia's southern borders, and secondly, this was a fantastic excuse for an errantry war, giving the countless young nobles of Bretonnia a chance to earn their spurs in honourable combat against a genuinely vile and evil southern invader. Louis even felt so generous as to extend an invitation to the Empire to join in the war as well, urging them to too send forces southwards to aid his errantry war. And the Empire responded, even though it was at the time in the midst of a civil war, and, well, when isn't the Empire in the midst of a civil war of some sort or another? They did indeed dispatch troops, both state troop levies and, of course, famously, huge numbers of knights, both those hoping to create their own knightly secular orders eventually, and also a significant number of Templars sent out from shrines and holy places across the empire. The unified Crusader host would join together in Bretonnia, and then sail around the coast of Estalia towards the Tilean city of Tubaro that would serve as their forward operating base. It was far enough away from Estalia itself to not be immediately vulnerable to any Arabian offensives. And whilst the sea journey was long and in possible danger of being intercepted by the Arabian navy, the Bretonnian seagoing forces provided able and active protection and escorts to the vessels. Tabara was also a far more easily accessible supply point for the Crusaders, rather than going the long way around the western coast of Estalia through the forests and mountains to finally reach Margarita. Granted, even Tabaro required some serious mountaineering capabilities, as they would, to cross into Estalia itself, have to cross the Abasco mountain range, and several fortified towers and villages in the area. These natural choke points would change hands several times, as the crusading hosts and the Arabian armies flowed back and forth across the Abasco mountain ranges, seeking approaches to get into the mainlands of Estalia, and the Arabians managed to besiege Tabaro no less than 5 times, although the majority of those will likely have been from the sea, forcing the crusading host to return and retake their base of operations. As the moment they managed to enter into Estalia proper, the Arabian armies quickly found themselves incapable of standing up to the crusading host in the open field. Jafar realized that this was quickly becoming an untenable position. Without the ability to control the countryside outside of the major cities, the only conceivable fate for the Arabians in Estalia would be to be besieged. And although the sieges themselves could last many, many years, possibly even decades, with their only retreat route being via the sea, any Arabian force trapped in Estalia would almost certainly be surrounded and completely destroyed due to blockades and sieges. Jafar therefore chose to pull the main strength of his armies out of Estalia after a few years of war, leaving behind some garrison forces in the major cities to delay the Crusaders' pursuit of his army. There were also significant elements of the Arabian military who simply chose to abandon Jafar at this time. Those who had invested too much effort, too much money, and too many men into the conquest of Estalia to simply give up and go home now. One of these was a sheik by the name of Vazar the Cruel. Now, this is where the story gets a little bit muddled up here, as Vazar was supposedly a breakaway commander from the Arabian military. However, he is also supposed to have been fighting alongside the Castellan of Margarita, Mustafa Amar, who had been deliberately left behind by Jafar to hold the city against the Crusaders, forcing them to lay siege to it and thus delaying any pursuit of Jafar's primary forces. Why a renegade commander like him would be allowed into Margarita by the Castellan is unclear. But it was supposedly Vazar the Cruel's Black Scimitar Guard who almost put an end to the Order of the Blazing Sun before they even became officially known as a knightly order. But famously, even as the knights were being surrounded and assaulted by Vazar the Cruel's elite guards, a massive statue of the goddess Myrmidia fell from the roof of one of Margarita's temples and crushed a substantial portion of the guards beneath its bulk, thus rescuing the knights and making them fund their order in the goddess's name. Somewhat complicated loyalty logistics aside, however, the crusading force was indeed faced with a tough choice here. They could either focus entirely on freeing Estalia, or they could try to pursue Jafar. Launching a direct naval invasion of Araby would be difficult and extremely risky, but would also potentially carry great rewards. The long overland route would be complicated and rife with danger of its own, although the Crusader hosts could no doubt be shipped to Tilea and beyond to the border princes, possibly even further south to shorten the journey somewhat. Furthermore, the crusading force also had to take over the rest of Estalia and siege down the troops left behind by Sultan Jaffar. But they could not afford to do so leisurely. They had to pursue the enemy from multiple directions if possible, and also take control of their remaining holdings. Instead of deciding to try and focus in on one of these, the crusading force split itself into several smaller portions, leaving behind the least mobile elements to take care of the remaining siege works in Estalia, specifically the reduction and the taking of Magritta, whereas the more mobile elements would be dispatched to Araby itself. This is yet again where accounts get a pinch complicated, as there are words of forces moving all the way down the coastal line of the Badlands to attack Araby from the eastern edge, and there are also other accounts of a major naval flotilla being dispatched to take on the city of Kofair, who lies on the other side of that advance, suggesting a dual-pronged assault, or possibly the dispatch of forces who had finished the siege of Magritta, who were then sent across the sea to help out with the Battle of Al-Haik. The latter seems the most sensible, as the journey down to the borders of Araby would have taken a very long time indeed, as the Crusaders would have to overcome several challenges and fight their way through a fair few green-skinned tribes as well before managing to do so, and then of course needing to cross vast open stretches of deserts to finally reach Sultan Jaffar's capital. By that time, Magritta had finally fallen, in a surprisingly short period of time as well, with the Crusaders utilizing rather brutal tactics, overcoming the remaining defenders, breaking into the city and going amok, slaughtering a significant portion of the remaining Arabian population, including the Castellan, who was killed by the Bretonnian knight Guy de Gavant, who was to be the future steward of Aquitaine after a disastrous battle at the city of Lashik some times later. The crusading armies then descended upon Araby, but unfortunately for them, they were denied a quick and easy victory. They had hoped perhaps to catch Jafar in the city of Kofair, one of the largest and most wealthy of the trading ports, also known as the Spice Port. The Crusaders had anticipated perhaps a significant battle for the city, having dispatched the majority of their naval forces along with a massive quantity of siege troops, foot soldiers and knights to the city. But Jafar had decided to largely abandon it, leaving behind yet another sacrificial garrison to bother and slow down the invaders, hoping perhaps that they might run out of precious resources like water before they could seize the city. That was not to be the case, as during another mass escalation upon the walled city, the Crusaders swiftly broke through its defenses and went on a murderous rampage throughout it, sacking, burning, and pillaging. This was an act that would be looked down upon by quite a few back in the old world itself, and even in the numbers of the crusading host. Many of the Templar knightly orders that had been dispatched to take part in the crusade had not signed up for this wholesale slaughter of what they viewed to be innocent civilians, whose only fault in this war was being conquered by Jafar many years before. Kofair, however, was now to be the sole singular foothold within Araby for the crusading host, and it was thus of paramount importance that the populace was reminded thoroughly as to who its new masters were, making sure that they would not rise up against them out of some misguided sense of loyalty or nationalistic heroics. The murder of its populace was unfortunate, and probably motivated as much by greed as it was strategic necessity, but it was nevertheless a necessity. Having been denied their ultimate target of Jafar, however, the crusading force now mobilized yet again to move towards the expected hiding point of the evil Sultan, the capital city of Al-Haik. Originally, Jafar had intended to try to hide behind its massed walls, outlasting the besiegers in a defensive engagement. But as both crusading hosts were closing upon the city, and the rapidity with which they had destroyed all other strongholds of Is, Jafar decided that he could not afford to simply sit about any further. He needed to go on the offensive. And the first step in so doing was ordering his most trusted, fiercely loyal and brutal general, Mehmed Bey, the Black Lizard, to sally out from the city and harass the invading crusaders. Seeking to at the very least delay their arrival to Al-Haik, giving Jafar more time to prepare, and possibly even, considering the favourable nature of the terrain, inflict such casualties upon the crusading host that it would be forced to turn back. Mehmed Bey's force was significant, and consisted of troops not only accustomed to operating in these areas, but a very nimble and rapid-moving force as well, made up of camel riders, along with the Akinsis, light skirmishers, and the Sifasi, heavy cavalry troops. He could also rely on the unnatural aid of a cluster of fakirs, Arabian wizards and magicians, many of whom claim to either have the services of the jinns, or, alternatively, perhaps, be in the jinns' thrall themselves. Launching countless small, harassing raids against the crusading armies, it soon became clear to Mehmed Bey that he would be unable to inflict any truly telling defeat upon the crusaders, as they marched in huge armoured columns down the coast, with huge Bretonnian warships delivering an endless supply of fresh water, the most precious of all resources in this parched and pallid climate. No matter how many times Mehmed Bey launched his Akinsis at the columns, the Crusaders would simply lock shields and outlast the bows and arrows of the light riders, never breaking ranks and never pursuing them. Well, not beyond the first time, anyways, as the Bretonnian knights found themselves counterattacked by Sipasi's lancers. Frustrated by his lack of success, Mehmed Bey turned to dark magic instead, ordering his fakirs to move out ahead of the advancing Crusader host and begin poisoning water supplies, specifically by turning the water into a strange sort of magical alcoholic liquid. Once the crusading knights reached the water supplies, they were so desperate with thirst that they would quench it with anything, even as they only grew more and more parched the more they drank. Combining their dehydration with the alcoholic contents of this strange magical water meant that a significant number of knights were rendered utterly helpless as the Arabian horsemen descended upon them. This became known as the Battle of the Nine Jackals, and was Mehmed Bey's by far single greatest success in the desert campaign. After this, however, swiftly moving yeomen led by errant knights were dispatched out ahead of the crusading force to fortify water sources and make sure that the Arabian troops could not approach them easily and carry out their rituals to poison them. It in essence became a war of water, where the Bretonnians relied more and more on their warships to supply them with fresh water. But due to the sheer scope and scale of the crusading host, this was a challenging undertaking at the best of times. Never mind the intervention of the occasional Arabian corsair ship trying to raid their supply lines. It was absolutely crucial the crusading host could supplement their flow of water with local sources. And so both the Arabians and the Bretonnians fought viciously over every single source within their reach. In the end, however, Mehmed Bey was not able to prevent the Crusade's advance, which eventually reached the outskirts of Al-Haik, where Jafar's army was waiting for them. It was, however, a much reduced host, having once boasted significant numerical superiority over the crusading invaders. Jafar, having now lost holding after holding and suffered defeat after defeat, had become weak in the eyes of the Arabian tribal leaders, and they were abandoning him in droves. Every time they saw a chance to escape, they took it. And so, his primary source of manpower, the desert tribes, had been bleeding away from his control now for weeks and months at a time, until he could barely mount the same numbers as the crusading host. But whereas the numbers were approaching, even the quality of the troops involved were anything but. With a solid base of serried ranks of Bretonnian infantry and Empire State troopers to protect their rear, vast spearheads of super heavy armored horse rode out from the crusading host, smashing huge holes in the Arabian lines, tearing the Sultan's army apart piece by piece, and scattering yet further dozens of formations of spearmen into the deep desert and falling desperately back to the city of Al-Haik at their backs. It very soon became apparent that Jafar's force could not stand up to the unrelenting offensive of the Knights of the Old World. He attempted to call upon ancient desert spirits commanded by his fakirs to assault the enemy, creatures of sand and stone, but they, too, could not stand against the knights of Bretonnia and the Empire, nor could their foul magics resist the attentions of the Crusade's own magic users, who blasted them with bolts of force or unraveled their subtle incantations, causing their bodies of sand to melt back into the Arabian desert. Even Jafar's most unholy allies, having quite recently concluded a pact with the ruinous powers, abandoned him, having claimed everything they could from the vile Sultan. Even the forces of chaos let him stew in his fate. And as for his furred friends, they too were nowhere to be seen, despite no doubt countless promises that they would, at long last, show up in strength to aid their most precious and worthy ally, yes. The Sultan eventually managed to make it back to the city, and a brief siege followed. But after the destruction of the majority of his forces, and with the eventual destruction of Jafar's own personal guard holding his massive private palace, holding Al-Haik was obviously impossible. The scattered remnants of the Arabian army attempted to flee into the desert, but were also in turn chased down and destroyed. The Sultan himself slain by a Bretonnian lance thrust through his back as he fled, and broken off as it lifted his body off the ground. Though the crusade would not even end with Jafar's death, as some of his favoured lieutenants were still alive. During the battle and short subsequent siege of Al-Haik, Mehmed Bey had been attempting to aid his master, leading his own forces in a march against the crusading army, but arrived too late to save Jafar. Turning instead around, heading for the Corsair city of Lashik, hoping to ensconce himself behind its walls, or possibly even taking a ship to some distant location. His army was ruthlessly pursued by yet further crusading knights. Both, of course, to stamp out this last spark of evil in Araby, but also, perhaps more so, to take revenge for the Battle of the Nine Jackals and the horrific murder of their Crusader brethren, who had been left hanging from trees with salt stuffed into their mouths. The crusading force finally caught up with Mehmed Bey during the Battle of the Black Lizard, where the crusading host both outmaneuvered and outfought Mehmed Bey's trapped troops, raining fire down upon them from wadi walls whilst crushing his troops by massed cavalry charges, finally claiming the life of Jafar's last faithful lieutenant. With this act, the war was largely at an end, although the crusade would continue for a little while longer. The Corsair city of Lashik, for example, was later besieged, and, as all other Arabian cities had, eventually fell to the crusading forces. Although, in this case, it came at a significant cost as well. When the Duke of Aquitaine fell to some vile enemy poison during the siege, which in turn raised up Guy de Gavendon to Castellan, steward of Aquitaine. This would later turn out to be a terrible, terrible mistake, as the poison that slew the old Duke would, well, it would kill him, but not quite in the traditional way, shall we say. And on the topic of unnatural death, there was also a much smaller crusade as well that broke off from the main crusade force. These ventured into the deep deserts of Nehekhara, some for wealth, like the group of Bretonnian and Imperial knights that descended upon the old capital of Bel Aliad, that had now been claimed by a huge Zinchian chaos cult. These crusaders were never seen again, and some claim that they had been transported into the very realms of chaos itself. Another fraction of the crusade, of Templar Knights of Moor, ventured into the desert specifically to seek out the undead and attempt to lay them to rest with the blessing of their patron deity. Unfortunately, Moor does not have much in the way of authority of the Nehekaran dead. And so, whilst the Black Crusade cut a dusty path of shattered bone through Nehekhara, it was not the purge they had hoped for. And eventually even the Knights of Mor, realizing that they could not stand any hope at all of cleansing Nehekhara, turned around and returned home as well. Although they did not leave empty-handed. One of the more enthusiastic hangers-on of the Crusade, a Chilean merchant prince by the name of Giovanni Lanfranchi, had landed his own mercenary horde in support of the Crusades, and had happened across a complex of dusty old tombs in Nehekhara, as for one reason or another he had managed to land not in Araby, but in Nehekhara. Having thus been guided to this tomb complex, he fought against its undead defenders and extracted from it significant wealth, including a mysterious book. Having been chased out of Nehekhara shortly thereafter, he joined the primary Arabian Crusade, where he encountered various Knights of Mor, showed them this strange black book, and they took a great interest in it, pledging to protect him and his loot until it returned back home to Tilea, which he did safely. And learning all manners of horrific secrets within, he dedicated his life and his wealth to creating a specialized order of Myrmidian vampire hunters, dedicated to the goddess and the eradication of the vile undead, that now, clearly, according to this book, plagued the old world in far greater numbers than anyone had ever realized. But, by and large, all true military resistance was now at an end in Araby. And whilst there would still be the occasional battles here and there by additional crusading forces, this was largely the end of the conflict. And the knightly orders returned home very, very, very wealthy indeed, forming countless new martial orders in the empire. And for the Bretonnians, their reward was no less significant. The knights-errants that had been dispatched had all earned their spurs, and now returned wealthier than ever, intent upon taking their own parcel of land, building castles, and aiding in the defense of Bretonnia. There would even be later crusades as well, venturing back into Araby, though on these occasions focused more on Nehekhara than the Arabians themselves, who indeed never decided to aggress upon the old world again. And so one could happily say that the Crusades fulfilled their purpose on many a level, and were an undisputed good. And with that, we are at an end. I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and until next time, have a good day.